Welcome to Accented, everyone. Tonight we have the honor of speaking with Andre Dao and Kevin Nguyen. My name is Philip Nguyen. I'm your co-host slash MC slash hype man for Accented Dialogues in Diaspora, which is presented by the Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network, or DVAN. Welcome if you're calling in from the West Coast tonight, or if you're calling from down under. Good morning. This is our 47th episode. The finale of the fifth season of Accented Dialogues in Diaspora, titled Echoes of Elsewhere, Finding Home in Memory and Imagination. For those of y'all who are joining us 5 years later, 47 episodes in, welcome back. And for those of you who's this is your first time here with us, welcome. To talk a little bit about DVAN before we get started, DVAN's mission is to foster diasporic Vietnamese and Southeast Asian literary voices. We empower artists in the diaspora and champion our complex and diverse stories. We are refugees, immigrants, survivors, and their descendants, and know that our stories must be heard. And if you haven't already, be sure to check out our website, dvan.org. And if you'd like to consider donating to support this show and to support so many of the other projects that we have got going on as an organization, I want to also take this moment to thank our sponsor, AppLovin, whose leading marketing platform provides developers a powerful set of solutions to grow their mobile apps. AppLovin, AppLovin's technology platform enables developers to market, monetize, analyze, and publish their apps. The company's first-party content includes over 200 popular, engaging apps, and its technology brings that content to millions of users around the world, like how we bring so many people from around the world across the diaspora here to you. AppLovin is headquartered in Palo Alto, California, with several offices globally. Y'all can learn more at applovin.com. In case you didn't know, this show is being recorded and will be available to access after the show for those of y'all who can't make it, both on our YouTube page, our website, and on available on Spotify, Apple Music, and wherever it is that you listen to your podcast. So make sure to give us a rating, a like, and a review. So we can keep this show going. We're also, I'm just gonna make a subtle plug. We're looking for a new sponsor for our next season. So if you know anyone who's interested in sponsoring, maybe it's an alcoholic beverage company, please let us know, and we'll make sure that you get the shout out as we do each of our shows for the next season and for the future. And we want to again thank AppLovin for sponsoring the past few seasons for Accented. I'd now like to introduce you to our co-host, Viet Nguyen, whose novel *The Sympathizer* won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. His most recent books are *Simone*, a children's book illustrated by Minnie Fan, and *A Man of Two Faces*, a memoir, a history, and memorial. He's also the editor of the Displaced Refugee Writers on Refugee Lives and one of the co-founders for the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network. Welcome back, Viet. Episode
Hey,
47.
hey, Philip. Great to be here with you. Can't believe we're at the end of season 5. Terrific to have done this with you for so long and to end this season with two wonderful writers with two terrific novels. The first writer we have is Andre Dao, who's an author and researcher from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. His debut novel, Anam, won the Prime Minister's Literary Award for Fiction, the NSW Premier's Literary Award for New Writing, and was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Literary Award and the Voss Literary Award. All big deals in Australia. In 2024, he was named a Sydney Morning Herald Best Young Australian Novelist, and he is the co-founder of Behind the Wire, the award-winning oral history project documenting the stories of the adults and children who have been detained by the Australian government after seeking asylum in Australia. Hi, Andre. Good to have you with us.
And Viet, hi Philip. Thanks so much for having me. It's very exciting to be here.
And our second novelist is Kevin Nguyen. He is the author of the novels Me Documents, or My Documents, depending on how you read it, and New Waves. He is the features editor at The Verge and was previously a senior editor at GQ. He lives in Brooklyn. Hi, Kevin. Great to see you again.
Good to see you, Viet.
Let's start with this, which is that I actually recently saw both of you in person. Kevin, that was in New York City, and Andre, that was in Los Angeles when you came for your book tour for Anam. And you recently just went back to Australia. I'm kind of curious, as an Australian, what did you think of the United States in its current iteration that you saw?
I mean, that's a loaded question. No, so it was personally a really interesting trip because I think it was sort of the first time I've really traveled in a way where it felt like I was moving through the kind of diaspora network. So in one sense, I got this very lovely, warm experience of America where I was sort of traveling to new cities and felt like I already had this network of people who were, really generous and kind and engaged with the work. I guess by the same token, I also felt like I was meeting a whole bunch of people who were in all different ways involved in pushing back against the craziness that's happening over there at the moment. So, people working on immigration stuff, people working on climate stuff, transgender and women's rights. And it really felt like you're all kind of fighting on so many different fronts all at the same time. So it was kind of it was a bit of a, yeah, it was a strange trip in that way because personally it was very warm and, politically it felt pretty fraught.
You're such a polite person, Andre. By the way, for those of you who don't know, Andre's other background is that he's a lawyer. That will factor into the novel that we're discussing. But, what just happened in the news today relative to Australia is that this Australian writer, Alistair Kitchen, says that he was just deported when he arrived in Los Angeles on his way from Australia to New York City. He was deported, he claims, for his writings when he was at Columbia University as a master's student on the student protesters there. And supposedly, Customs and Border Patrol were able to find his writings, even though he had scrubbed his social media. So this enters into a new level of surveillance, possibly for people who are coming into the United States, whether they are non-Americans or whether they might be U.S. citizens and residents. Did you have any anxieties coming into this country as an Australian?
Teaching somebody's and it was, I mean, interesting, kind of before getting on the flight, kind of consuming a whole bunch of news about detainments and deportations and sort of being added to a few groups of folks who are kind of giving advice about what to do with your phone. And so yeah, I brought a burner phone over. It made me think about what I was going to post on Instagram before coming over. So, you know, do I post about attending a kind of pro-Palestine rally, in the days before flying? And it sort of, I think what was interesting for me was the ways in which already, I was kind of engaging in that sort of thought processes of self-censorship, right? And going, do I, you know, to what extent do I try and curate a version of myself, um, either online or like kind of also what story do I tell when I get to the border? And I did have to have a conversation with the border official who says, what are you doing here? And I think actually he just got annoyed because it was just too confusing an answer, kind of going, "Oh, I'm here for a book tour, but also doing some research and I'm seeing some friends." And then he actually had a go at me about, but what are you going to do next? Go to a birthday party? And actually I ended up being invited to a birthday party in Brooklyn. So he was right.
Maybe you've given us a clue as to how to circumvent Customs and Border Patrol. Just overwhelm them with, too much information that they can't make sense out of. But, we're talking about these kinds of things because, your novel, Anam, as we'll get into, does deal a lot with politics, but politics more of the past. But nevertheless, when we look upon this past of what the, French Indochinese past was like for the Vietnamese, I think it was probably pretty apocalyptic for a lot of those people. And there's an interesting contrast between these horrifying politics of the past that we have some distance from and the horrifying politics of the present for some of us. Now, before we got on the screen, Kevin and I were chatting, and Kevin, I was asking you about your feelings about the contemporary politics of this country, which me documents or my documents also really deals with as well as we're going to get into. And you had an interesting response. You had a very drastic response when the question of whether or not you and I had any contingency plans for worst case scenarios here in the United States. What's your contingency plan?
Yeah, I mean, we're both U.S. citizens. I mean, part of this came from I had just spent 2 months in Saigon. We got back like right after the inauguration. I think part of it, my partner and I were just like, why did we come back to this stupid country? The coffee's not even good. Um, but yeah, I work as a journalist full time. And I don't know, like we just, especially earlier in the year, not that things have de-escalated, but I think the feeling was a little more heightened earlier in the year. And when you work as a journalist, you just start to wonder like how quickly you'll be targeted by this administration. So our line of just like we were thinking about what has to happen before we decide to not necessarily like leave this country permanently, but to just take a little time away, maybe go back to Vietnam. And yeah, I think the line we decided on is as soon as Trump starts arresting journalists, and I feel like deporting people for their writing. I mean, that's getting pretty close to that line.
It's extremely close. It's extremely close. And obviously the threat's already out there, given what happened in Los Angeles this past weekend. There, these even floating threats, as Tom Homan did, of arresting Karen Bass, the mayor of Los Angeles, and Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, if they dared to interfere with the National Guard. I mean, we're right up there in terms of actual, even more higher degrees of political suppression. But you did tell me that you thought you might get Vietnamese citizenship. I don't know if you're joking or not.
I definitely looked into it quite seriously. It would be quite difficult because I don't have any like meaningful family over there at the moment. And I do hear there's a lot of bribery involved. And I was like, oh, how much though? But there is actually there's like a 5-year visa for Vietnamese abroad that I have all the documentation for, and I just need to make my appointment at the embassy.
Okay, well, if you decide to get Vietnamese citizenship, let me know because it'd be interesting. I've thought about that before, but I assume when you have Vietnamese citizenship, you're subject to Vietnamese law, which is a whole nother set of challenges for a journalist going to Vietnam. Have you thought about
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, I've been, I was gonna say I've been asking around, but no one really has the answer. So I'm just like poking around Reddit. So we'll see how that goes. I'm curious if they would let you in Viet. Like they don't even translate your books over there, right? So
Trust me, Kevin, I know all about it. I'm gonna have to do a
I'm
little bit of
also
research before I fly back.
I'm also wondering, like, I mean, maybe for the 50th, like 2025 marks the 50th anniversary after the end of the war, and maybe there's this mass exodus of people from the United States going, or across the diaspora going, returning to Vietnam. I know I'm planning to go to Vietnam with my partner for a trip later at the end of this year. But I'm wondering for both of you, both of your books, Me Document, Kevin, and then Anam, Andre, they're being published in 2025. How much of the context, Vietnamese context, cultural context, historical context, uh, went into your both of your books being published this year, and how have you sort of been processing or navigating the 50th anniversary in your respective communities? So with you, Kevin, yeah.
yeah. It was just like a total coincidence. I wasn't thinking about it. It's funny. I got back to the States in February, and I was getting all these requests to do things for the 50th anniversary, and all of my Viet friends, especially who are creatives, were getting these requests. So it was kind of funny. We've never been busier, but it was also like not a thing that like we were thinking about. People keep asking me like, "Oh, what is your family doing for the 50th?" And I was like, nothing. Like it's not like it's not like a thing we celebrate as like Vietnamese Americans.
Right.
And yeah, like it's been a couple months, and just like me and all my Viet creative friends, like we're back to no one asking us for anything.
Oh man, not even to be on the book tour.
The book tour has been fine, but I just like I'm just being a little flip, but like just like suddenly everyone wanted this like really specific thing, and we just were joking how we'd never been busier. We go back to being like a normal amount of busy, and that's exactly what happened.
Andre, what about you for the 50th? Are you back at a normal level, busy, or is it now ramping up?
Um, there was a couple of the requests that Kevin was talking about, and at first actually, I kind of thought, oh, nothing to say about this anniversary, at least not in kind of sort op-ed sort of form. But it was only when I sort of thought about, I guess, like, how can I relate the 50th anniversary to the present that I got kind of interested in writing. So I did write a short piece for the Guardian, and really that was trying to think through, I guess, like, so I guess the background for me is, so Anam came out in Australia in 2023, so it was a total coincidence that it came out this year in the States. But it sort of it's a happy coincidence in a way, I guess, because it is a novel that is really thinking about what does it mean to remember the past, Vietnamese past, in ways that can create a future that we actually want to live in. And so that was sort of the question that I was asking in the op-ed was, okay, as a community, if we are marking this 50th anniversary as this a way of marking the fact that there are these traumatic histories of suffering in our community, but what do we do with that? Right? Like, do we use that to turn out to sort of turn insular and to exclude, or do we find ways to like reach that across to other communities and other histories of oppression or suffering? And that's a big question, at least in the Australian Vietnamese context. In the Australian Vietnamese community, kind of um, think about how we seem to remember our own stories and histories, but actually make that connection to the fact that that's an ongoing struggle for plenty of other people as well. And that's sort of the question I wanted to ask.
Mm. Do
So,
you,
Kevin,
yeah.
okay, you want to ask or you want me?
Oh, go for it.
Okay, well, I was going to ask Kevin because, your novel, May Documents, is explicitly political, and in a very interesting way as well. I can describe it, but I'd like to hear you describe the concept of your novel, because it seems as if you might have gone to your publisher and said, I have this great concept. And so let's hear it.
Yeah, I just well, I'll say like the context of it is that since for a long time I've actually been reading a lot about Japanese American incarceration in World War II. Uh, Part of it comes out of this deep embarrassment of never having learned about it until I got to college. I grew up in Massachusetts, went to public school, and we did like an entire year about World War II, and Japanese American incarceration never came up once. Not even for a day. I think if you go to California public school, you get like some of that education. It is also really funny and alarming how different our educations are, just like on a state by state level. But that's a different thing. Um, and so I originally wanted to write kind of a historical novel about Japanese American incarceration. But Julia Tsuka exists and she writes incredible novels about the subject already. And so I imagined something slightly different. I thought about what if that happened again today, like an echo of Japanese American incarceration. And then I wanted to write a book about Vietnamese people. So I was like, what if the subject of this policy, of this executive order, was Vietnamese Americans? So that's kind of the backdrop of the book. And it sounds like a very like dramatic concept, but it is like mostly a family story. And I thought about like, oh, like if young people who just have all of these ambitions, like to do well in school, to do well in their jobs, to do well on their sports team, to become an engineer, that kind of thing. Like, what happens if like all of that goes away? What does their life look like when just like the dream of assimilation is just like pulled out from under them and they're sent to camp? And so I think the novel is, it's about this family that's kind of split up by the camps, but it's also like about kind of the existential dread of being in camp, but also like the day-to-day things they feel really annoyed and petty about. It's a lot of like young people like trying to learn to live without the internet.
I mean, it's not that even that far from reality in some ways, because obviously, we already have a camp. We have Guantanamo set up to handle people. Who knows who's going to be sent to Guantanamo? And the possibility that Vietnamese or other Southeast Asians or Asian immigrants or refugees in general might be sent there is not so far-fetched, given that we are actually deporting dozens and dozens of Vietnamese and other Southeast Asian people, refugees or their descendants, to, well, hopefully Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, but in at least one case to South Sudan.
Yeah.
Although I believe that gentleman actually ended up in Djibouti, the last that I read. Um, the whole other, so the whole landscape is so absurd and bizarre. You can't even make up some of these circumstances in reality. And here you come along making a novel that might seem absurd until we think about the absurdities that are actually taking place.
I know. I think when I started this concept, I wanted it to reflect. I wanted the book to be grounded in reality, but maybe like a reality that was like kind of heightened. Like some of the stuff that inspires the book. It's not just Japanese American incarceration. It's not just the legacy of the Vietnam War, but it's also like contemporary migrant detention. my work in journalism, like I have done a lot of stuff about the Department of Homeland Security, about CBP, about ICE, about migrant detention. So I just wanted to put some of that context in the book, but just heighten it a little bit. And then like come 2025, I wish I had heightened it slightly more.
Andre, in your book, you describe it as a bricolage of weaving fiction, memoir, interviews, philosophical reflection. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that means, what it's about, how you, uh, what was your motivation or inspiration behind writing it?
So yeah, so Anam is a novel that it actually started off as fiction. So it started off as a kind of family history project, stories of my grandparents. So in particular, my grandfather, who was a political prisoner in Vietnam for 10 years after the end of the war. Um, and so yeah, I tried to write what I thought was a fairly straightforward chronological version of a like true history, and then I quickly found that um, I couldn't do it for various reasons. One was, you know, the kind of historical documentation that might exist in other places for other families just wasn't there, right? Like there's just so much that I couldn't access or didn't exist. And then when I went to speak to my grandparents, so I've had these long interviews with my grandfather in particular, but he sort of passed away halfway through that process. So again, it kind of reached this point where I realized that I can't get this kind of through story. Um, and then in particular, I then went to Vietnam and met some of his family who had stayed in the north and had actually kind of risen through the ranks of the Communist Party, and are actually you know, kind of doing really well now. And speaking to them about how they remembered their brother, who had converted to Catholicism and become kind of an anti-communist intellectual. I kind of realized that there wasn't really this one easy true story that I could tell, but it was actually all of these different conflicting memories about who my grandfather was, but also what Vietnam is as a place and was as a place, what the war is about. And so I think my way of trying to write about all of this kind of like conflicting stories and versions of history in the past was to kind of throw in all of these different kinds of sources, as you mentioned. So rather than just telling it as a kind of narrative, it was okay, I'll throw in some, you know, essay and philosophy and history. And originally there was actually a lot more photos in the book. There's now just they've narrowed it down to there's one historical photo in there, but it was sort of, yeah, it's approach to just throw everything in there and in that way try and better reflect actually the experience of what it was like to try and come to grips with this history rather than, you know, kind of smoothing it out.
I want to ask you both, since it kind of you both touch on Vietnamese cultural identity and history. Like, what was the reception or response that you've gotten from your families and communities for um, both your books being out there in the world, kind of touching on slightly touchy topics, more perhaps like tense topics in the Vietnamese American community, especially as it relates to politics.
Yeah, I can jump in on that. I was I mean, I was pretty terrified, to be honest, when as the book was getting close to being published in Australia, of what my family would think, particularly, you know, I guess I took this story about my grandfather who had been imprisoned, and in, I guess, the family kind of mythology around that was he'd become this real heroic figure for the family, but quite a flattened figure. Like a lot of his complexity had been sort of completely removed from the way my family talked about him, and in particular, it removed both his sort of early kind of communist sympathies and the way he had always been interested in kind of an independent Vietnam, and he'd been interested in sort of fighting against the but also it entirely removed the way he eventually then became involved with, I guess, the South Vietnamese regime, and particularly its collaboration with, you know, the Americans to to fight the war, right? And so I kind of tried to think through some of that stuff. And I was really worried that my family would see that as a betrayal. I think it was interesting then when the book actually came out, um, they responded really positively. And I think in some ways they responded positively, seeing kind of other people's responses and seeing reviews and sort of going, okay, so maybe people are interested in this complexity, or they're interested in some of the darker sides of our story that's not necessarily shameful, but actually it is helpful or useful to talk about this. So it ended up being quite positive, but I had been pretty scared beforehand.
It's funny. I keep waiting for like the conservative members of my family to read it, and then I was just like, oh, they don't really read. Maybe if they blast it on Fox News, they'll hear about it. But actually, the thing I was a little nervous about was there's kind of this thread in the book about like what right we have to tell the stories of our parents and grandparents. I do kind of think often as a journalist or as a storyteller of any kind, whoever's telling the story like has a lot of the power. And the book wrestles with that a bit, as I do as someone that does this for a living. So I was kind of wondering if my family would see the themes about like, oh, like, this relationship where someone, like is passing you, like you pass down an experience and then someone else tells the story, like, is there a way that can be exploitative? And yeah, I think they get it. I think they like realize that like the book is also that sort of complicated thing in action itself. Like the book is about a thing, and then the book perpetrates that thing as well. And so, yeah, I don't know. I had like a pretty good conversation with my parents about that, and it's kind of like the first time that like we really like touched on it in a meaningful way. So personally, that was like really quite gratifying. But yeah, I think some of the themes of the book, like actually, like I think it calls into the question like the things that I do for a living.
So obviously, yes, the stereotype, is that people on the right don't necessarily read novels, let's say. I don't know if it's true or not. Okay, this is a gross stereotype. However, you're a journalist, Kevin, and I assume people read journalism, some of the things that you might put out as a journalist, and you just did a special edition of The Verge on the 50th anniversary. You had some Vietnamese American artists and writers in there. Have you thought about what would happen if you took if your family read your political opinions, if you had written about them as a journalist?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think I think the conservative side of the family, like they already know not to read any of the writing I do as a journalist. And I don't want to like say that all conservatives don't read. I just think the ones in my family don't read. But yeah, so actually I'm actually just like less afraid of that, because I think the way I think about the two kinds of writing, in journalism, like I think the goal or the project writ large is to take like things that are complicated and sophisticated and try to make them clearer for the reader. And I think in fiction, I think we try to take assumptions that seem clear, like morals that seem clear, and then we try to like muddy it up as much as possible. So in a strange way, I think to understand like the journalism that I get to write and publish, I think it's just like clearer to understand the mission there. And then with the novels there, I think they're a more complex, they require like a higher degree of a certain kind of like literacy, that I don't know, I'm starting to feel like a lot of people are less interested in, a lot of this country does not possess, but that's, that's the ambition of the art.
We talked about betrayals just a little bit earlier, and in your novel, Kevin, of course, the biggest betrayal is what the United States government does to these Vietnamese Americans, sends them all to detention camps. And then, of course, the next betrayal is that a lot of Americans just go along with it. So these Vietnamese Americans are suddenly shocked that all of their liberal friends are not standing up for them, including their Asian American friends. So there's sort of an indictment there of even Asian American liberalism. But going down even further to the part that might offend your family, there are, the most intimate betrayals are the betrayals between family members. So there's a father with two sets of children who are the four kids who are four young people who are at the core of the plot in this novel. And then the grandmother in this family actually also, we fairly early on learned that, oh, grandma just sort of arranged to leave grandpa behind during April 30th. So these kinds of betrayals at the intimate level, I think, are oftentimes just as fraught as the political level of betrayal, whatever, whoever thinks who betrays who, like different political factions think there are different kinds of political betrayals happening. But at the intimate level within families, this is where it's oftentimes the most painful, is the sense that there are intimate betrayals taking place. And so your novel decides to explore those intimate betrayals. Really, it's the dramatic material of the novel, even more than the political betrayals.
Yeah, I actually think the characters are like, it's funny because like a lot of the way the book is talked about and like a lot of the reviews, and they've all been positive, so I've quite liked that. But they kind of see it as like a very political novel, and I think the politics of the novel are the context. But I think I wrote this to be a family story. I wrote it to be about characters. It's about how like individuals move through a political context. It's not a book that is like moralizing or finger wagging about politics, and that's like always a distinction I'm trying to make. It's like it's political, but it's not like political art, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So your professions both come into play in this novel, in these novels. We'll get to Kevin's journalism in just a moment, but Andre, you're a lawyer. The protagonist of the novel is a lawyer as well. Was it I mean, I'm sure it was a strategic decision to make this novel, the protagonist, someone who's has the same real life profession that you do. Was there a sense of this having some kind of connotations of auto fiction, or just having people think about whether there's a thin line there between yourself in real life and your protagonist?
Yeah, so and as you've referred to him as the protagonist, or call him the narrator, and very deliberately kept him nameless. Or actually, yeah, in one of the final edits, an editor picked up that there was a kind of allusion to the narrator's name, that they were like, "Oh, do you want people to think that his name is Andre?" I'm like, "Oh, actually, I need to remove that." So it was even the way I was slipping up, right, of kind of um, blurring that line. But I think, I did want to actually really bring that into question for people, of have that sense of, am I reading this kind of memoir? Am I reading a novel? Precisely because I think it helps to bring those sort of questions of like truth and what we're responsible for imagining to the fore. And I guess in that sense, the profession of a lawyer was pretty deliberate as well. And, I guess your training as a lawyer is to really worry about a certain kind of provable truth. And I think that is a helpful contrast to the kind of truths that you can get to with fiction. It's precisely all the things that aren't provable. Um, and I guess we in law have this, I guess, a certain hierarchy of what is evidence, and certain hierarchy as well of the kind of witness that is, um, you know, most truthful or authentic. And I think fiction allowed me to really explore what is that like. Why are certain kinds of official documents taken as truth without too much questioning? Why is a grandmother talking in the kitchen about um, uh, like what kind of truth value would that have in kind of official histories or in a court? Probably none. But kind of in a novel, in the kind of truth world that a novel builds, that might be like the most important um, bit of evidence. Right? So that's what I like to get at.
I think for people who are not lawyers, the idea of what lawyers do can be so frustrating. Like we can look at a situation like, of course that is murder, or of course that is genocide, and then the lawyer's job is to say, well, no, it's not. You're going to go through all these legal distinctions and bodies of evidence and definitions and things like that, and the conclusions of lawyers have to draw on these bodies of legal discourse, whether one accepts those legal discourses or not. Whereas for a novelist, it's a very different set of judgments that a novelist can render. So I can go around saying genocide this, genocide that, and I don't have to prove anything to anybody in a kind of facetious way, but there's some truth to that, to the ability of the novelist to make historical and moral judgments that lawyers necessarily may not necessarily be able to do. So as you were writing the novel, did you feel a tension between the work of a novelist and the work of a lawyer? Did being trained as a lawyer interfere or with your work as a novelist, or did you think it helped you as a novelist in some way?
I mean, partly the experience of writing this novel over a long time while doing legal work was, I mean, it was quite personally therapeutic, because one of the things that really frustrated me in the legal work, particularly with seekers and refugees, is the first thing you do as a lawyer is you sit down and you do an intake interview where they're supposed to tell you their story. And usually people have all sorts of things they want to tell you, and your job as a lawyer is say, that's great, none of that's relevant. I need to ask you this precise set of questions that will fit your whole life world into a very specific evidentiary chain to make a legal argument to get you maybe not even the thing that you really want, but the thing that as a lawyer I can provide, which is some kind of, temporary relief or some kind of temporary status. Whereas what they really want is A, justice, and B, for someone to listen to their story. And as a lawyer, you're kind of going, oh yeah, that's, we kind of have to move on now, or I can listen to you, but none of that can go into the document that we're making. And so I guess in some ways the work as a novelist was to feel very free from all of that. And then I guess at some point I realized that actually, so that feeling of freedom was great. And then at some point I also realized actually I'm also operating now without any of the safety net of being able to just say, well, I'm only doing this because this is what the law says. Actually, I'm on the hook for, so when you say, you could make a moral judgment about genocide, um, it's interesting because then you're also saying, well, I'm making a fully formed moral judgment that this is genocide, rather than being able to just say, well, I've looked at this strict set of legal principles and I'm making this objective um, statement, and none of me is involved in. I'm not really putting too much of myself on the line in making that. So I think that's where I also realized coming through all the way through to the other side was, oh, actually, as a of, yeah, I'm on the hook for everything that I'm writing.
I guess for Kevin, I mean, since we're on this trajectory of talking about how much your professions influence your writing and your books, one of your characters is, I mean, you're a journalist. One of your characters is also a journalist. I'm wondering also, I mean, how much of this character Ursula is inspired by I mean, Ursula and the rest of the family as well. I mean, was there a point where you yourself discovered an paquete? Especially I know, and I know you mentioned like the pettiness of well, I want to ask you about the characters, and also I know you mentioned about the pettiness of the Vietnamese American family and how these relationships come into tension at times. But also, there's if I remember correctly, her family's in the camp, Ursula, and then her cousin is feeding her the information that makes her famous. Could you talk a little bit more about Ursula and journalism?
Yeah, I wouldn't say there's like any one-to-one with the characters. I usually like imagine when I'm like motivating a character, I put them in a situation, and I feel like if I throw a dilemma at the character, I usually make them do the decision that like I personally would not make. I'm like a very boring human being, and I think these characters are more exciting if they act the opposite of me. Um, so Ursula is a journalist. She is talented. She's savvy. She's also like very power seeking, as many journalists are. And I think that's a very compelling. It's very compelling as a character. These people are like real. They're journalists like that, because I think there's a way to justify a lot of fairly immoral or bad behavior under the kind of moral auspices of what journalism is supposed to do. I think we agree that like the project of a free press is important to a democracy. so like working hard at this job and succeeding at it, like that feels moral, but there are still like acts within it that you can do that are immoral and certainly unethical. So Ursula is a character that is just like navigating that, and then I think toward the end of the book finds herself on one end of that, instead of the other. But yeah, to your question, the engine of the book is a bit like two of the siblings are in camp and two are outside, and Ursula's half sister Jen is able to get messages out of camp. And so she gets them to Ursula. And so Ursula has like this exclusive access to a peek inside of camp that no one else has. And from that, she's able, it's like the scoop of a lifetime. It's a continuous series of scoops. And Ursula's career really takes off while Jen is languishing in camp. And I thought that dynamic, it's just like a very heightened version of like, I guess it's like the most heightened, most cynical version of like writing about your grandparents.
Randy Neil Stratton, who I've met, has what I think of as one of the most difficult questions that I ever get asked. And it's a question about, important books that have influenced you. We'll get to Randy's question. I just wanted to put it out there so that Andre and Kevin can think about it, because whenever I'm asked, like, what are you reading and who do you recommend and who's influenced you? My mind just goes utterly blank. Randy, it's like the worst possible question to ask someone like me. So I just want to make sure Andre and Kevin have some time to think about this, and me too. But, we're an interesting moment. We're at an interesting moment for Vietnamese diasporic literature. I'm the co-editor of an anthology along with Isabel Thuy Pelot and Lan Yung called The Cleaving: Vietnamese Writers of the Diaspora, just published by the University of California Press. Has about 37 Vietnamese diasporic writers in there, engaged in dialogues with each other. They hail from the United States, Canada, France, Australia, and Israel, Kazakhstan as well, and from Vietnam itself. And so it's really sort of I think, a landmark anthology, because it lays out this claim that Vietnamese diasporic literature is really global, has dozens of award-winning published authors of many degrees of renown, and so on. And there's no doubt that when we talk about all those countries, the country where the diasporic literature has been the most visible has been the United States, simply because there are so many Vietnamese Americans here. So Kevin is a part of that, and Andre is a part of the Vietnamese Australian diaspora, which has not been quite as visible as this different, I think, political and cultural climate, demographic situation in Australia. But there are Vietnamese diasporic writers in Australia who've achieved some renown as well. Nam Le is probably the best known of the Vietnamese diasporic Australian writers, but we've had Tracy Lin Nguyen on here as well. Vivian Pham is also published over there. But in comparison to the Vietnamese American situation, which I want to talk about with Kevin in just a moment, where there are dozens and dozens of Vietnamese American writers, Andre, in your case, as a Vietnamese Australian writer, to come out as a Vietnamese Australian writer still seems kind of a landmark occasion, because there's really, just as far as I can tell, a handful of Vietnamese Australians with books that are out there. Do you still feel in your situation that burden that, oh, there's just not enough of us, and there's still this expectation that if you're a self-identified Vietnamese Australian novelist, there's still this sense that you still have to represent what's going on in the Australian community?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, that was a really interesting part of visiting the States, and I guess over the last couple of years, just engaging more with Vietnamese American literature and Vietnamese and Asian American literature more generally, was kind of realizing that in a way, Australia is lagging behind, or at least I have this strong sense that the conversation that you all are having about um, Vietnamese diaspora writing is more sophisticated than what we're having, at least at that kind of a public level. I think we're having really fantastic conversations within a very small community of Asian Australian writers, of sort of wanting to push the boundaries of what it means to represent your community and the kind of what it means to write like a migrant novel or a refugee novel. But it does feel like that I'm coming to realize now, it's like in a way we're having a conversation that has happened um, over sort of decades already in the States. Partly, I mean, that'd be a demographic thing. We're a small community here in Australia, but then I guess more broadly, it would tap into kind of it's a really deep anxiety in Australia about the place of Australia in Asia and its relationship to Asia. And it was interesting to speak to some folks recently about there's actually this moment in the kind of late 80s, early 90s where kind of Australian political leaders tried to do this pivot to Asia, and saying, Australia is actually part of Asia. We need to really engage with it. And there was a sort of generation of non-Asian Australians who took that seriously and went, okay, we're going to learn Asian languages, and so really engage with Asian culture. And I can sort of see that now. There's a certain generation of folks older than me, who are experts in, you know, say Vietnamese literature or Vietnamese law, even in my faculty here in Melbourne. And then that just stopped because we had a Conservative Prime Minister who came in and said, no, actually, Australia is British. And, we have this deep kind of British history, and we are going to really reorient ourselves to the Anglosphere, in particular to America. And there's just a certain version of what America looks like. So in that sense, I have this sense of, oh, there was maybe a time when we actually had the potential for a more sophisticated conversation got put back a couple of decades, and now we're kind of catching up.
But I mean, not one good thing, but one aspect of Anam that I found really striking is that it doesn't feel like this is a first generation novel. In other words, the stereotype of the first generation Asian American novel, which might apply to Asian Australian literature too, is that it has to deal with certain kinds of immigrant or refugee or cross-cultural generational clash kinds of narratives and so on. And just goes way beyond that. It's not, I mean, that those are maybe sub-themes in the novel, but it just really feels like a very sophisticated, approach to history and memory that I found very impressive. And likewise, Kevin, you're in a different situation where I don't know where you are on the Vietnamese American literary genealogy, whether there's 30 or 40 or 50 authors that have preceded you with books, but there's been a lot. And me documents or my documents, and by the way, we haven't gotten into the title of your novel yet, but we'll get to that in just a moment. But me documents is surprising too, because its plot is not like anything we've seen before in Vietnamese American literature. So did you feel, I don't know if you see yourself as a Vietnamese American writer, but if so, did you feel liberated by the fact that there was 30 or 40 or 50 writers coming before you, or did you feel like, oh no, now they've said everything and I need to find something new to say?
I think it's just the privilege of coming later, and so I was never that deliberate about it. Like when I sit down to write the things, I'm not thinking about the context of the canon that I would fit in, which, I think if I thought about that, it would I would never put anything on the page. It'd be just too crippling as an idea. I just had like themes and stories and characters I wanted to put on the page. And, I just I have like a really strong memory of my parents coming home with the Book of Salt, by Monique Chung. And like they were just ecstatic about that book. And even, that book's over 20 years old now. And so I don't know where that fits in the genealogy. You have like a better sense of this than I do, Viet. But like even then already, right? Like the Book of Salt is not just like, it has nothing of like the first generation immigrant novel or anything like that. Like it's a completely different thing. It's its own thing. And so like, even when I was young, like I was liberated from that. So
I love it that your parents brought home the Book of Salt. Wow, that dates everything, because the Book of Salt was, I just saw Monique in New York actually, and we talked about this. So I'm going to get the date wrong, but I think it was like 2002, 2003 when that novel came out. And yes, it was just something remarkably new on the landscape, both of Vietnamese American, but Asian American literature as well, American literature too. But it's also awesome that it was your parents who brought it home. That's not the usual Asian American writer origin story, because it's like, oh my God, my parents burned all the books because they wanted me to be a doctor or something. But instead, your parents brought the poison home
yeah.
directly. So where does tell us about the title and break it down for the audience.
Yeah, so it's me documents. Me obviously means America in Vietnamese. It originally was when I write like early drafts, like I just put in little jokes for myself that I think are funny. And so the title was a joke because I was like, my publisher will never let me put like a diacritic in the title of an American book. Um, I don't know, like, and then when I showed it to my editor, she was super into it. And I was like, okay, well, if I can get away with this, like, we need to do this. Um, but it's funny, I've been getting a lot of questions about like the correct way to pronounce the title. Um, and just like, just like my last name, like there are a couple ways of saying it, and you can say it the Vietnamese way, or you can say it like the way everyone else does. And I think both can be correct. So it's about like me. It's so funny. People are just like so afraid to say like my documents if it's me documents. It's just like I just think it's like that's sort of the world we live in, and that's like the world reflected in this book, of just like the two different perspectives, and I think they can just both coexist.
But me means what?
America.
America. There you go. Okay, so I made you do the act of translation and of punning here. But hey, that we have a question now from we have a couple of questions from the audience, and Philip's going to kick us off.
Yeah. I mean, I also have a question about like, how did you choose to translate Viet or Vietglish into your novels? But we'll go with Tomo's question first. They asked, did the 50th anniversary of the end of the war influence how you narrate your stories? And did it affect your ideas about nations and nationality-based communities? Go with you, Andre, first.
Sure. So yeah, I think, I mean, it didn't directly affect the way I wrote Anam, just because of the timing of that book. But I think actually, so one of the, I guess, the conceits of Anam is that um, the narrator kind of comes up with this idea that rather than talking about the Vietnamese diaspora, he talks about them being Anamites, so this sort of um, race of people who are obsessed with the past. They can't let go of the past. And there's a couple of scenes where the narrator is sort of, I guess, probing the sort of anniversaries that would come up with the 50th anniversary, like in terms of displaying the South Vietnamese flag and kind of being obsessed with this lost country. And in a way, getting to the 50th anniversary and being asked to write something about it sort of made me have to go back to some of that. I guess, like, in a way, I was kind of satirizing what I saw in my own community of this kind of obsession with this past, in a way that felt um, disjointed from the present, and particularly disjointed from the kind of futures that I wanted to live in. But the 50th anniversary made me have to sort of re-evaluate that a little bit, or to sort of remember kind of, okay, actually also this is a really meaningful moment, both for folks in Vietnam who are actively celebrating it as really a moment of unification and liberation, and also a moment of like deep trauma and pain for other folks. And I guess taking that seriously again, while also, I guess, remaining kind of skeptical about the whole process of linking identity to these dates.
So just on the question of your novel title, just since I asked Kevin about his novel title, Anam is the northernmost of the three parts of Vietnam that when the French invaded, in my opinion, and took over Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, the French created Indochina out of five parts: Laos, Cambodia, and then the three parts of Vietnam, of which Anam is the most northernmost part. But that has been spelled Annam, and your novel title is Anam. Why the difference?
Yeah, so I definitely wanted to pick up on that old name for at least part of Vietnam, or sometimes it seemed to have been became synonymous with the whole of at least Vietnam, or the whole of Indochinese culture. So I wanted to pick up on this idea of, well, this place has had these different names and these colonial names as well. And then, I mean, the change of spelling partly was to say, okay, I'm playing with that idea, but also I'm not beholden to that history. This is sort of this other concept, this sort of imagined country. But then Anam also, I guess, was a reference to this ancient Greek idea of anamnesis, which is that actually we have these eternal souls that know everything, and then we forget everything that we know when we're born. And then actually knowledge is a matter of remembering what we've forgotten. So I thought it was sort of a neat tie-in to some of the themes. So a pun, I guess, as well, but maybe I have to say your pun is funnier, Kevin. I like it.
Philip, the fact checker, reminds me that Tonkin is the northernmost part of French Indochina, and Anam is the center, right, Philip? You're the historian here today. Um, Kevin, 50th anniversary, Tomo's question.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny that like we all get asked about like the 50th anniversary as if like a year ago, like this hadn't affected us for 49 years, and the year before that, 48 years, but only at like a big round number do we get to talk about it. Um, and part of it too, it's like it's not just journalism, it's like many constructions like it. It's like, oh, like when something's a big round number, like then we can talk about it again, like then we can revisit history. And thematically, that a lot of that is in the book, even if I wasn't, I had no idea when this book was going to come out. You never know how long something's going to take to write when you sit down to do it. So I wasn't targeting like the month of the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon. But thematically, I really think it's like, oh, like why do we pick these dates? Like why do we pick these anniversaries when it's like these things are with us like the entire time? They happen year in and year out, day in and day out. And someone has decided that because it's the 50th anniversary, like now's time we get to commission essays about it.
Now we get to what I think of as one of the hardest questions ever to be posed to writers, which is Randy Neal Stratton's question. As a reader, I'm most interested in writing that will potentially expand or even change my perspective. Are there any books, fiction or otherwise, that have had a particularly powerful impact on your own perspective? And Randy adds a postscript that the writer Fukjan, who we've had on the show before, the author of Saigon, who said that the autobiography of Malcolm X had a significant impact on him, which led Randy to read the autobiography of Malcolm X and realize that the persona of Malcolm X in that autobiography is radically different than the stereotypes of Malcolm X that are out there. So I don't know which of you, Kevin or Andre, want to answer this question first. Which work has had such a powerful impact on you, fiction or otherwise?
I go first. I think on this book, structurally, I was reading The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury when I started. And originally, the way the Martian Chronicles is structured as a work of fiction is it's like a lot of vignettes about this colony on Mars. So some of the chapters are really short, some of them are like full short stories, and it kind of does this like incredible world building. So that was like really influential on me in writing this book, which obviously has like nothing to do with the Vietnamese diaspora. And then I think a nonfiction book that really broke my brain a little bit was Bring the War Home by Kathleen Belew. And it basically draws the line between the end of the Vietnam War and the rise of white supremacy in the United States. This book is great. It's like you will like whip through it in 2 afternoons. But it just like, I think like a great nonfiction book, like it makes you think about all these like loose ends in your brain, and then like suddenly it like tightens them into like a knot. And that was the experience I had reading that book. So I really think everyone should pick that one up.
Cool. Andre, what about you?
So for me, the book that I guess, as Kevin puts it, broke my brain was Book of Daniel by E.L. Doctorow. So that's his novel that was loosely based on an execution of the Rosenbergs, so accused of being Soviet spies in America. And Doctorow imagines the Rosenbergs having 2 children, one of them, Daniel, who narrates his novel about his parents going on trial and being executed, and sort of being, the son of these traitors to the state. And for me, that was really, so I read that, as an undergrad, and it was the first time I really, I think, came across a book that did all of these wild things with history and fiction, and kind of working with essay and there's a fantastic sort of set piece about Disneyland in the middle of it. Yeah, which really expanded my sense of, okay, this is what a novel can be, and this is what you can do with history, which I didn't realize for a long time until I was sort of halfway through writing Anam, but actually this was deeply lodged in my psyche.
We did an event together in LA, Andre, where I said that I thought the German writer W.G. Sebald was somehow present in your work, because I could see these stylistic and historical concerns and concerns about memory between his amazing fiction and nonfiction and yours. And I was dispirited when I asked the question, how many to the audience, how many of you heard of W.G. Sebald? And almost, I think, like two people raised their hands. I was like, oh my God, how is this the case? Especially since, at least in the literary world, when Sebald was still alive 15 or 20 years ago, if you asked that question, he was very much in the forefront of the literary discussions. But maybe he's too literary of a novelist in our day and age to remain in the conversation. I mean, there's so much when we get to the question of who are you reading and it's oftentimes the writer who is the flavor of the moment that people talk about. And someone like W.G. Sebald, I feel, has such literary, philosophical, historical, political gravity that maybe it's too much for readers who just want to consume whatever is hot at the moment. But Sebald, has he been an influence on you?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's an interesting question of what who gets remembered and how you come across authors as well. I think I took Zabo because of this mutation, I guess, particularly as a certain kind of young man who had ambitions to be a writer. I was like, oh, give me the hardest, most difficult white man author, and I'm gonna consume that. So, but then yeah, of course, then upon actually reading Zen and being kind of hypnotized by his
I don't think
so
Sebald is that hard. I think he's actually very hypnotic. I think that was a word that you used. But it's just the impression that people get with Sebald, and it's a present in your work
right.
too. These very intense discussions about memory and philosophy and culpability, because Sebald deals with as a German writer who was born during World War II, deals with German culpability in the Holocaust. Really, really beautiful, beautiful writing. But last question for Andre before we get to Philip's last question, which is, Andre, what about Australian writers? What Australian writers might have influenced you, or are there none?
So I to go with Alexis Wright. I don't know if he's kind of um, but in his travel to the States, he's a new sort of Indigenous writer. I think it's completely. So you could begin with her novel Carpentaria, um, the latest novelist. It's just completely kind of remade what I think the Australian novel can be. So she sort of takes her one new cosmology, takes Western literary influences, place. So she puts James Joyce takes that new cosmology about Joseph and then somehow makes it come together in a way that I think is genuinely a new kind of thing that no one else is doing. So she's the most author Australian or otherwise, I think. So,
Thanks,
Philip, you
Andre.
have one final question.
My final question is, who is it from the Vietnamese, Southeast Asian American diaspora that y'all are reading, or that our audience should read, or that have inspired your work or maybe complementary to your work? Just off top.
You said Asian or Southeast Asian?
Viet, Southeast Asian, or Asian American. We can take one of each. We can take one as a whole. I'll leave that one up to you. Just
I think it's one that's like less necessarily directly inspiring, but I recently started rereading Rejection by Tony Tilatamudi, who's a Thai writer. this book it's a short story collection. It is just like, it'll just like make you feel all of the ugliest feelings that you've ever encountered. And I think everyone should just do that on a Sunday afternoon.
We might need to invite him onto Accented in the next season. So thank you for the
Good
plug.
idea.
Andre.
Uh, I'm gonna go with Naarm Lee, but actually not the boat, which is sort of well known for, but his latest book of his 36 ways of writing a Vietnamese poem. So I think in terms of to go back to that conversation about sophisticated ways of writing, you know, Vietnamese writing, Vietnamese literature. I think that's a really excellent example of something. It's a long poem that's really unpacking all the different layers. That's sort of questions of what does it mean to represent a community? What does it mean to write from a certain identity?
When you have a Namale on the podcast, please ask him why he writes so slowly. I feel like I read The Boat when I was like, in high school or maybe even middle school, and we just like waited like decades for the next thing.
Now that's an exaggeration, Kevin.
The question goes to you and then for you to take us home. Take us home. Take us out for the
I
season
told you I
finale.
hate that kind of question. Now my mind has totally gone blank. Okay. No, I'll go with Linda Lay, right? I mean, Linda Lay of France, a major French novelist, major Vietnamese novelist, also concerned with many of the issues that we've been discussing around history, philosophy, memory, violence, betrayal. Her novel, Le Calomnie, which was translated into English as, I'm trying to remember whether it's scandal or what.
Slander. Slander.
Slander. Yes, major impact, for example, on Monique Jung, who cited Linda Lay as one of her influences as well. And so, she's in the same genre, I think, as a writer like W.G. Sebald, who's been concerned. Both of them are concerned with the impact of horrifying history on individuals and their communities as well. So really a groundbreaking figure in Vietnamese diasporic literature, whether or not she would have wanted herself to be classified in such a way, her being French and all, but certainly a major figure in literature. Oh, am I taking us way out?
And
Okay,
that's a wrap.
that's a wrap. I can't imagine a better way to end our 5th season and the 50th anniversary of 1975, whatever that means to you. I'm not even going to use any words or adjectives or anything like that. We just know it's a historically significant moment, 50 years after 1975 for Vietnamese all over the world. Thanks so much to Andre and to Kevin for being with us here today. Check out their books, My Documents or Me Documents by Kevin Nguyen and Anam by André Dao. Thanks to you. Thanks to the audience out there. We will see you back in the fall for the 6th season of Accented.